Hi everybody, and today we're gonna have an interview with Marc Morera. He's an author of a new framework for asynchronous PHP, and he also organizes the first conference about asynchronous PHP, which is gonna happen on 26th, 27th March in Barcelona. Hi Marc, how are you doing?
Hello, nice to be here with you today.
Yeah, thank you. So, what is DriftPHP? Why do we need just one more framework in, PHP ecosystem? Because, there is even a joke when every senior developer should write own framework just to understand how things work. So, what's the point of DriftPHP?
Well, basically, the point here is that there is a small mistake taking consideration that ReactPHP it's the same language that PHP itself. Of course, both are based in PHP. PHP is based on PHP basically, and ReactPHP is just a library on top of PHP. But when you model your domain, choosing ReactPHP or directly PHP itself without any kind of external library support, your classes, your methods are going to be completely different. So from this point, taking in consideration that DriftPHP is just another framework, it's like a wrong decision, the wrong point of view about what DriftPHP is. DriftPHP is the first framework on top of ReactPHP. So if you want to model your entire domain, if you want to build an application on top of ReactPHP, you won't find any other framework on top of that technology. So yeah, it's another framework on top of PHP, but if you want to use ReactPHP, there's no other frameworks out there.
So under the hood, it is based on ReactPHP and on Symfony components, right?
Exactly. Symfony components, I take Symfony components. I take as well framework bundle, that is the bundle perspective of what Symfony is. And I take ReactPHP components as well. And managing both components, mixing them, and checking the skeleton architecture of Symfony, what is, from my point of view, a good thing when you want to build a new framework. Then you have DriftPHP. So it's basically, if you work with Symfony, you will find that DriftPHP is mostly the same. You can define services, routing, you can define auto-wiring, you can define whatever you want the same way that you can do in Symfony, but taking the advantages of working on top of ReactPHP.
So we can consider it as a non-blocking asynchronous Symfony, right?
Exactly, that's right. Yeah, basically, yeah.
So how did you come up with this idea? So yeah, I have read a series of your articles where you try to make Symfony kernel asynchronous, you try to put promises there, then you build an async kernel, and now you have a framework, right?
Well, basically the first side of that component, of that idea, it came I've been using Symfony for the last 8 years, or 9 or 7. I don't even remember how it started. But I am very used to working on top of Symfony components and the Symfony skeleton. I mean, the best applications in my life have been built on top of Symfony. So I started some months ago working on top of ReactPHP components as well by doing some stuff with PHP-PM. And by using PHP-PM, I understood what ReactPHP was. So from that point of view, I decided that I wanted to make my domain as well on top of ReactPHP. So you have a server that is on top of ReactPHP. You have a domain that is on top of ReactPHP. And if you understand a little bit how ReactPHP works, how the MLlab works, how promises can be used, then it's going to be very easy for you to just think that if you want the whole application work on top of ReactPHP, you need all that small layers to be working with promises. That means that the Symfony kernel stops in the wrong way, the promises that are generated from the domain layer, for example, making a Redis call, that promises are stopped in the kernel. So you can't take that promise and put it on the server, on the event lab in the server, and start making non-blocking calls. So at this point, I decided that the first step was thinking about how to change the kernel of Symfony. Not changing the kernel itself, but allowing the handle method inside the kernel and the HTTP kernel to allow not only returning responses, but allowing as well returning promises of responses. So I started with that proof of concept, that it was just cloning the kernel of Symfony and adding some small refactorings inside the kernel. Then I had to refactor a little bit how the event dispatcher works, because you're going to work as well with promises instead of returning values. And that's it. So at the entry point, you handle a request and you can expect a promise of a response. And on the other side, the controller inside Symfony application, it's not longer necessary and required to return a response anymore, but you can return that promise generated in your domain layer or infrastructure layer. So at this point, you have 3 layers. All 3 layers are built on top of ReactPHP promises. So it means that you can have a whole ReactPHP application. So it started as a proof of concept. I had, I worked so hard to make sure that the proof of concept could be a small, not a component itself inside Symfony environment, but a starting point of working on that direction. Symfony community was not, for my perspective and about what I saw, was not much interested in that field. So I decided that for all that PHP people working on top of Symfony, was very interesting to have that alternative to jump to ReactPHP framework called DriftPHP in a very easy way.
So it is not only about the code, yeah? Inside your application, you have also now to think that your application now becomes the server, yeah? There is no Nginx, no Apache. Your application is a server, and you should keep it in mind.
Exactly. It can be an Nginx, it can be an Apache. I'm not sure how it should work right now, but what you have here is that one of the components of DriftPHP is the server itself. So you don't need anymore that process manager that manages you several workers, because inside this worker, each request is blocking one. You don't need it anymore because your code is not going to be blocking anymore. So you can have like thousands of requests at the same time working with one little server. And if the code is properly designed, all the requests at the same time are going to work properly with the concurrency. So with one server, you can like have tons of thousands of requests at the same time, and no one is going to block anyone.
Mm-hmm. And what was the idea? What does drift mean, if it is not a secret?
No, it's not a secret. It means absolutely nothing. If you go to all the projects I've built in my life, I need to admit that for naming, I'm not that bad. But if you go to find a name, the reason, the rationality behind each name of my life, you will find nothing. I mean, what means other naming in software architecture world? Nothing. So DriftPHP, yeah, I thought something very fast, something, like making some drifting. Maybe it has the origins on Need for Speed, maybe. I don't know. But that's not important, Yeah, it could be named like other ways.
So you sat down how it should be titled? Drift. Oh yeah, let's write down. Yeah.
Exactly. Literally. I mean, yeah.
Okay. And so we can consider it as a non-blocking Symfony, event-driven Symfony on top of ReactPHP. It is also a built-in server. It can be used without Apache on Nginx. And what are the common use cases? Why I should use Drift and I can't use, for example, traditional synchronous Symfony?
Of course, the idea of using DriftPHP because you can't really use another framework, it's a bad idea. I think that most of applications nowadays, having the servers we have and having the language we have with PHP 7, I think that most applications can be done with any kind of framework if you know how to model good architecture. But what this framework tries to do here is to put an alternative on terms of performance. So, for example, if you want to build an e-commerce on top of PHP, you can take Cilius, for example. You can take natural PHP, any kind of framework. You can take Symfony itself to building that small components like cart or whatever. But you can also take a framework like DriftPHP, and of course, all your model is going to be absolutely the same. Instead of returning values, you will take in account that you will start returning promises, what really makes the software non-blocking. Instead of waiting for the result, you're going to return a promise, and you will put that promise in the event lab. This is how it works other languages, for example, Golang, in another way of Go routines or whatever, or for example, Node.js. So yeah, for example, e-commerce or a small application, small microservices, and API REST, for example, it's so easy to work that way. You can work with PHP unit as well. You can test. What you will have here is that there's some pieces, small components, small libraries inside the PHP environment that is going to be a bit difficult for you if you want to work with that on top of ReactPHP. When I say difficult, I'm saying quite impossible.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, if I want to write something performant in PHP, I should consider some, let's call them pitfalls. Yes, some things that will come with a lot of pain, or it will be even impossible, to do a thing. And what are they?
Yeah, for example, you cannot make a file get contents. What seems something,
obvious.
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's a function from PHP. Okay, I should be able to do that in my PHP code, but what you should take in consideration here is that while you make a file get contents, from the moment you call that function until the moment you take the result, the PHP thread is completely blocking, because you have to consider file system as infrastructure layer as well. So if you have a unique server with thousands of connections there, even we can start talking, for example, with WebSockets. You can have dozens of thousands of WebSockets connected in that thread. What happens if you make a file get contents? During that small time, the whole code, the whole WebSockets, the whole connections, HTTP connections are going to be blocked. So the event lab is going to be blocked. So that means that, for example, functions like file get contents, if you go to Doctrine, for example, all the calls in MySQL or SQLite, all that queries are blocking. So that means that you cannot use Doctrine on top of DriftPHP. That's not good news. But from the other perspective, we can build something like Doctrine on top of ReactPHP, and we're going to have at that point a deval or NoReam not blocking. What it's good news from that perspective of ReactPHP.
So I can't, if I think about DriftPHP as a Symfony on top of ReactPHP, but actually I can't just get any component I like, pull it into my project and use it. I should consider what's inside,
Yeah, well, you can have some component actually. you can have all components on top of Symfony that don't require really, non-blocking actions like file get contents or whatever. In fact, if you have a file get contents action inside a Symfony component, for example, for requiring a tweak template, they have a file get contents. You can manage how to make that file get contents before the server is actually working and starting listening to the WebSocket. So you can do that. In fact, DriftPHP has a tweak adapter for working with tweak that basically what it does is make all that file get contents before the free request is handed. So if you want to make something blocking, you have to make it at the beginning before the first request. So as soon as the first request is handled by the kernel, then the component itself is not going to have to make that in-out operations anymore. So everything is going to be allocated in memory.
So how it works under the hood? Yeah, the application starts. Yeah, this bootstrapping process executes, and then it just keeps alive. Yeah, we have
absolutely
a running kernel, and it runs asynchronously. So we can think about it as PHP PM, which reduces this bootstrapping time, and on top of it, we also have performant non-blocking asynchronous kernel, which keeps running and handles all requests.
Well, that's quite different between there's a big difference between PHP PM and Drift. PHP PM is just a collection of Symfony workers that between requests, the same kernel is reused once and again. Okay.
So Drift is not about reducing the bootstrapping time, yeah?
You are actually reusing the same kernel across all the requests you have, but it's not only about that. Because in PHP PM, the kernel that is used is a Symfony standard one. So what you will have in the PHP PM is that it's actually blocking. You have to make one request after the other one. Okay? So if you have enough requests at the same time, long requests at the beginning, short requests later, short requests are going to be stopped until the first long requests are completely returned and fulfilled. So this is not going to happen anymore with Drift, because it's not only by reducing the same kernel, but of making asynchronous and unlocking requests. So you are taking advantage of both things at the same time.
That's great. And okay, if it is written on top of Symfony, right? And let's imagine that I already have a Symfony application, yeah? It is running on the latest version of Symfony. It is running on the latest version of PHP. It has op cache, but I have a leak of performance I want to improve. Will it be hard to migrate, from Symfony to Drift? Because under the hood it is actually the same, yeah? There's Symfony and there's Symfony.
Yeah, it's not going to be difficult. In fact, there is one application that it could be considered the first application on top of DriftPHP. It was actually built on top of ReactPHP before DriftPHP was actually started. That is AppySearch. AppySearch, it was built on top of Symfony. Basically, was Symfony. And I started translating it from Symfony PHP, regular PHP to ReactPHP. And it's actually on top of DriftPHP already. So it was hard to make something like that. Not actually. Basically because I had a strong layer of functional testing there. So it was easy for me to be sure that the refactoring was already done and properly done. But at the same time, because, changing from Symfony to DriftPHP is like changing from Symfony to Laravel, even a bit more harder. If you think about that you will have to change your classes. you will not have to change the logic of your classes, but the way it works. The classes are not going to expect to return the result, but a promise of the result. So you are going to change maybe some part of the controller, some part of the commands. But for example, the configuration layer of your servicer are going to be exactly the same. You will not have to change the routing there. You will not have to change the way you sort your classes, you organize your classes inside. At the end, it's going to be exactly the same, unless you work, for example, with Doctrine. In that case, that's not the best moment for changing DriftPHP. To be honest, and to be, for me, it's important to say that DriftPHP is not a production-ready framework. DriftPHP is 2 or 3 months old. So DriftPHP, and for me at the same time, the ReactPHP community needs some time to make that growth, to start building some external and third-party libraries, like for example ADVAL on ORM. But for me, DriftPHP is just the beginning of something like that. We already have a MySQL adapter, Postgres adapter, you have Redis adapter, a RabbitMQ adapter, you have a Twig adapter, you have a server, you have an HTTP kernel, you have, an adapter for preloading all the things before the free request is served. So we already have a lot of things, but they are not enough to make something for production ready. So we are on that direction, and that means that the more time we have to work on that direction, the better performance we're going to have, the better libraries we are going to work with. And of course, the more people we have, the better and the sooner we are going to be able to work with production-ready framework. For example, for me, it's not good to have a production-ready framework if you don't have a library that works with, with any kind of metrics third-party service. For example, New Relic. If you can't go with New Relic, then a lot of people, a lot of companies are not going to be ready for DriftPHP. So that's the direction we have to take if we want a project ready for production.
So you can try, but be ready that...
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important to start digging in how ReactPHP works. And for me, it's the most important thing. What are the advantages of working with ReactPHP instead of PHP? And you will find that, absolutely. Maybe it's not now the moment to work with that on production. But what if in the future the community was large enough to make something really good? In terms of performance, it could be a new stage for PHP community, for the whole PHP community, not only for Symfony users.
And you also should think that when you migrate, that you don't have an application in the request response cycle. You should monitor, supervisor use or something else that your application is currently running, that it doesn't fail and,
Well, not the server itself. It should take care of, to be sure that all requests, each time a request fails, it should fail inside the scope of the request itself, not just shutting down the server. So the server should be always running, even if requests are failing. That should be the direction of the design of the server itself. So you should not have to need any supervisor. Basically, because if you put there a supervisor, the Docker, inside Docker, the entry point is not going to be the server itself. What it's really important, it's going to be the supervisor. So what can happen here is that you have the supervisor running and all workers just stopped. It's the same problem that you can have with PHP PM. So for me, the thing that the server itself and the code itself and the thread that is actually handling your requests is the entry point of Docker. So if you are working with Amazon Web Services, Amazon Load Balancer is going to take care that you always have like what and versions of the server running at the same time with the load balancing. In that case, the load balancing, because all requests are non-blocking, can work directly with run robin instead of marking it's working if it's busy or it's not busy.
So you should keep an eye not on the server itself, but on the container, yeah?
Exactly.
Oh, I see.
But the container, the thread number 1 in container, so the entry point is the server itself. So if the server breaks, the container is going to break. What is important in terms of Docker?
Yes. And you mentioned that when you moved in your application, yeah, API search from Symfony to Drift, you had a lot of tests, right?
Yeah.
Functional tests. And okay, if we consider request response cycle, it is obvious. But how do you test your application which is always running? Does it differ from traditional testing, or it is the same?
At all, it is the same. If you test any component that instead of returning you the value itself, it returns you a promise. There is a library on top of ReactPHP that is actually built by one of the people that has already done ReactPHP from the scratch. That is Christian Lueck. There is a library that is called Block. So what you can do if you have a promise, you can just wait for the result of the promise, and that's it. Then you can assert with the content of the promise itself. So it's basically the same, but you need to have that layer of waiting for the promise response.
So you just move from values to promises, and you assert that the promise resolves with something, or the promise rejects, and you check the exception.
Exactly. If you wait for a promise and the promise rejects, then the exception is going to be thrown. So it's exactly the same that in PHP unit if you work with on top of PHP. Yeah.
Okay. Let's say that I'm brave enough to write my new application in Drift. It's okay for me to throw away doctrine, to write these low-level queries by myself. Where should I go? How should I know how to use it, how to write it?
Well, if you want to build your application on top of DriftPHP right now, I wouldn't say you're brave. I wouldn't say you don't have thought it so much. For me, writing DriftPHP applications today for production, I wouldn't say no. But if you want to dig in a little bit on that framework, I would say that driftphp.io, it's the documentation itself for the project, and you can go to github.com/driftphp and you will find a demo there. That demo is already built on DriftPHP skeleton, and you can find a small application that is actually doing absolutely nothing but saving some values in Redis and making some twig work. And you will find that instead of having 3, 4, 5, 10 milliseconds returning requests, you will find requests that are actually working in less than 300 microseconds in a non-blocking way. You will find that in terms of performance, DriftPHP it's much more faster than any PHP framework nowadays. But if you go with concurrency, you will find that the curve of growing of that concurrency, it stops maybe on 10 milliseconds. Even if you go with 1000 concurrency requests at the same time, the 50% of your requests are going to be returned in 10 milliseconds. If you go with that on any other framework like Symfony, you will have, if it works in your computer, you will have like tons of hundreds of milliseconds or maybe 1 second per request.
Oh, that's amazing. This demo application, it is just a hello world blank page, or it is something? It is
No, you can manage some key values there by using a adapter for Redis that is actually tested as far as I remember. You will find there some testing stuff. Well, I'm not sure about what I'm saying. I'm going to review it later. If it doesn't exist, I'm going to add some testing there to make sure that people understand how to test promises. But you will find that you can really call some endpoints to make sure that you can add some value in having a key. You can request it. You can list all values and query and keys at the same time, and you can delete it like a small REST application there. And you can use some tweak in order to show that even if you would use tweak, performance is not decreasing because using of tweak.
Everything is already loaded into memory, yeah?
Exactly. There is one component on top of DriftPHP that is called preloading. That what it takes is it asks to all components that actually are loaded inside of PHP, and it requests them, okay, preload your services, preload your classes, preload everything you have to preload before the first request is handled. So it's not because of the first request that I would like to make it as fast as possible, but what happens if you promote that service on your load balancer and at the same time you have 10,000 WebSockets connection? You don't want 10,000 connections at the same time building the same service once and again. So the service is going to be already built in.
And having, this sort of architecture now, on top of Symfony, on top of this asynchronous kernel, running this, very, very performant, what currently is the slowest part here in this request response cycle? What is the slow? Do you think it can be even more improved?
There's no slow part here. The slow part here in your application, it's going to be the PHP code itself. The more PHP code you have, of course, PHP is not as synchronous as a language. You will always do one thing before the other is done. So what you have to think here is that the hard consumption here is going to be about CPU. Of course, in memory as well, but you can reach the maximum memory, and then if you have a good policy of growing and killing servers, you're going to be able to do that, to solve that on top of Amazon Web Services. But what you have to think here is that tons of thousands of requests are going to use the same CPU. One CPU, there's one thread on PHP. So you don't have that Nginx or Apache or PHP PM that it's actually multi-threading. So you are using at the same time several CPUs at the same time. You will not have something like that. You will have one CPU used at the same time across all the things that are happening there. WebSockets, whatever. So it's time you make a long code of PHP that you are doing it at one time. During that time, the thread of PHP is going to be blocked by everyone. But that time is that small. That is not, you cannot go far. You cannot do better than that, in fact. So this is why, in fact, in DriftPHP and ReactPHP, when you talk about commands and queries, CQRS, and you take that writes asynchronous, you should not consider anymore to make your writes asynchronous because writes are non-blocking as well. So there's no need to make queues with writes there. But I would consider to make that writes not because of writes. I consider to take that commands to make it asynchronous not because of writes, but because the amount of time of CPU usage. I would consider that. The other part that can be slow, and I think that in the future is going to be a good thing to try to increase the performance, is the event lab. Taking into consideration that an event lab is a class that is actually making ticks ad eternum until the end of time. So the faster that ticks are done, the better the performance is going to be across all the actions that is actually done inside the server.
We are talking here about, hard computations, right? When
Yeah.
CPU is utilized. And how can I fix? I can run, if I have 4 CPUs, I can just run 4 containers
Exactly.
and they will.
Literally, yeah. You can have 4 containers inside that server, and then having a load balancer that just balancing between 4. The good thing, if you have, for example, 4 containers, you will be able to run the 4 containers at the same time using 4 CPUs, because at the end, it's like it's going to be multi-threading, right?
It will be multi-threaded asynchronous PHP, right?
Yeah, but using 4 threads of PHP. I mean, PHP is not multi-threading, but it's the way that you can really use the 100% of resources of your server.
Okay. But now we only talked about request response cycle, yeah? And
Yeah.
and we talked about HTTP kernel asynchronous. Can I write, asynchronous long running console command in DriftPHP?
Yeah, you can do that. I mean, for me, console things, it's not that important to be asynchronous. On terms of request response, on terms of application, I would consider making a console on top of ReactPHP to be sure that all the actions, all the in-out operations inside my infrastructure layer are done at the same time and in a concurrent way. Things are much more easy if you go with a console instead of a service. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you go at the end, console in Symfony, it's actually using the same kernel that is using the server, the web server. You will have a talk about how to work with console components on top of ReactPHP in the conference. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how Michael actually works with console.
Okay. That was interesting. I don't have any questions, so hope that the talk was interesting to others. And I think the main point is that PHP can be asynchronous, right? That in community you have tools to write asynchronous code. You have this low-level ReactPHP components. Now you even have a framework where you don't have to think about event loop, about this low-level stuff. You just have these components. Just think that you are now using non-blocking code. You can't wait.
Exactly. So if people that is actually listening to that podcast needs more information about what we are talking about, we are working so hard to make a small list of curated, resources for ReactPHP, not for DriftPHP, but for ReactPHP. That for me, it's the reason that we are already today here, to understand more how ReactPHP works. So if you go to the DriftPHP repository in GitHub, you will find the awesome ReactPHP list there. And at the same time, you can find like different groups of Slack and Gitter that some small communities actually are working on top of DriftPHP and ReactPHP in different channels. So I'm sure that people is going to be interested and should take that consideration that in terms of DriftPHP, maybe for next year, we will have something really, 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 really good for production. And we are taking that work because we want to make it happen, for sure.
I just one last question I have. Why ReactPHP, right? I know that you have chosen Symfony because you have to work with Symfony for a lot of years, but currently in async PHP community, we have several tools. We have ReactPHP, we have AMP, and we have Swooly, which is sort of something different. Why ReactPHP and not others?
I would say because the same. I would give you, and it doesn't say much more from me, to be honest. I would say the same response that I told you with the name of the project. Why not? I mean, I started digging with ReactPHP because PHP PM. And I was very impressed about all the components that are actually built on top of PHP without the need of any PHP extension. And for me, it's very good because you can start from the scratch doing anything. And it's, it's more, for me, it's so comprehensive how you are doing what you are doing on top of PHP, knowing that they are only libraries. I'm sure that Swole and AMP are good libraries as well, and that you can take good performance numbers by using that libraries. But maybe some other guy in another part of the world is going to have the same idea, but instead of ReactPHP, is Swole. And if you ask him or her the same question, the response is going to be exactly the same. Well, it's totally fair, because I think that we don't have time enough to start digging across, checking all the possibilities of everything, because my life, and it's important as well. And if I want to take care about something like DriftPHP or the conference, I need to be more, not taking that considerations, but taking one and working so hard on that direction. Otherwise, there's no time for anything, to be honest.
So thank you for your time, for answering questions.
Thank you very much for you, and I hope we meet again soon.
Yes, we have a lot to talk.
Yeah, sure.
So
have a nice day. Bye.
Bye.